Okay, let's talk a little bit about fussy cutting, since that's something I mentioned in this morning's post, and a lot of people were like, oh, what's fussy cutting? So fussy cutting is when we cut a piece of fabric so that an element of the design is specifically placed on our bag. That might be on a flap, it might be on the front of a bag. As you can see on this bag, and that's difficult to see because it's actually quite close up, but I need the camera fairly close so that you can actually see what I'm doing. The peacocks are central on the bag, and I fussy cut so that both sides of the bag have the same design. So that's fussy cutting. Now, that comes in several different methods. This one also was fussy cut so that I got exactly what I wanted. I wanted the design to be sort of equal on the side of the bag. It's exactly the same on the other side. I picked the pieces that I wanted to show where I wanted them on the bag. This is fussy cutting. There's also an element of fussy cutting even in something like this, in so much as this is the bag with no name, and I fussy cut so that my design is absolutely central on my flap. It's absolutely central on my front, and it's absolutely central on my back. However, what I didn't do was fussy cut so that my flap matched my back, which I should have done, but that's another story. So I talked about fussy cutting, and I'm just going to show you basically what I meant by cutting out the lump out the middle of the pattern piece. Now, this isn't actually a pattern piece, it's something that I literally just cut out of a piece of printer paper, but let's imagine that this is a flap, and I've cut the central part out, and I said an inch in my original post, but this is approximately an inch. Now I'm going to make a lovely bag with this is going to be the flap. Now let's just look at some fabric. I haven't ironed it or anything, but I need to pick where. I don't want it just to be random. I want to have a specific part of my fabric as the central part of my flap. So what I can do is I can take my pattern piece and I can kind of move it around, and I tend to call it audition the fabric almost. So I could have perhaps this seed head as a central part of my flap, and I know then that I can use my pattern weights to hold my fabric down, and I can cut my piece of fabric, and I know that that's going to be central. Or you can kind of maneuver it about. Let's have a look there. Oh, look, there's another sort of seed head that could be central. And you could, if you want it to be offset to the side, if you want something to go to the side, if you were going to perhaps put a catch there and you don't want that sitting directly above it, if you're a person that likes, doesn't necessarily need symmetry. If you want a particular part of the design on the fabric to be in a particular area on the bag, then this is how I do it. Now, this isn't a particularly big bit of fabric, but you can see there that there comes a point where there's a repeat on my fabric. So this is literally a scrap of fabric. So this seed head here is a repeat of this seed head here. So if I kind of fold that over, you can see that actually, in fact, if I folded it over there, you can see that if I'm careful, I can kind of match that up. So if I were making perhaps a pocket, I would cut this piece of fabric, fussy cutting, so that the pocket sits on the front of my bag, and actually nobody can see the pockets there. It's a hidden pocket, effectively. I'm disguising the pocket. It distracts from the eye to have quite a fussy fabric and then have a pocket on the front where the fussy fabric doesn't match up, or patterned fabric where the patterned fabric on the pocket doesn't match the fabric that's behind. So people fussy cut their fabric so that the pocket, the front of the pocket, is lined up with the fabric on the back. Now, to do that, basically what I would do is I would cut the main panel, and then I would take my fabric and I would kind of lay it in exactly the way as I've done now over the top, so that I've got a sort of a matching a matching fold with the pattern that's below, and I would fold it, and I would then put the top part of my pocket piece, my pocket panel, my pocket pattern piece onto my fabric using that fold line, but allowing the seam allowance above it. So I still have that fold line, you can see the fold lines there. And if I were putting a pocket on, let's use this as my pocket template. You would obviously have to check your seam allowance on your pattern. Most patterns have 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I would place my pattern piece 3/8 of an inch above that fold that I've made to allow for the seam allowance, because if you don't, you actually are going to lose some of this and your pocket will actually sit too far down. And that's basically how I do it. But I would mark, if my back panel is that wide, I would mark on this fold where the side bits of my pocket need to be. So I'd make a mark either side there where the side bits need to be. And then when I went to cut my fabric, I would lay my pattern piece on between those two marks, 3/8 of an inch away from the top edge, that fold that we made, which will be the top edge of our pocket. And we know that that fold matches our back fabric, and that when we make our pocket, as long as we stick to the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, or whatever the seam allowance is, if your seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch, then cut your pattern piece 1/4 inch above that fold. But that fold will show you where your pattern matching is, where your fussy cutting is. And fussy cutting and pattern matching are pretty much the same thing. You have to fussy cut to pattern match. And some people will say, fussy cutting, what's that? But it's about cutting your fabric in a certain way so that things will match or join together, or in this instance, it would be a pocket that perhaps disappeared. And you can see there that that literally lines up perfectly, apart from that side doesn't, but there's no interfacing on this, so I'm stretching, and it's a sort of a lining fabric. But you can see there that you can see a tiny line, but that pattern continues from this bit, which would be the back bit, onto my pocket, which would be this piece. So that's fussy cutting and pattern matching. Now, pattern matching, there's a lot more to pattern matching than just that, because sometimes if you've got a gusset and you want to pattern match, if you've got stripes and you want to pattern match, you do have to be very, very careful. But that's the very basics of fussy cutting and pattern matching on that sort of fabric. Now, again, this is the one that I used on the other bag, and you can see how you can, again, you can kind of audition particular areas of the design to sit on your bag, whether that's the front of a bag or the flap of a bag or wherever. You can move across. Maybe you want the little gnome, maybe you want something that's further up, bearing in mind that if you cut further up, you're going to have kind of half of a mushroom, so that's going to maybe possibly look weird. It depends. If you wanted to match your flap to the front of your bag, you might only need half a mushroom, because you might have the full mushroom on the front of your bag. It does take a bit of thinking about. It's not difficult to do. You do have to be accurate, and you do have to remember that fabric will have a seam allowance on it, because if you cut it so that it matches exactly and don't allow for the seam allowance, then things won't match exactly. It's fun to do. It's quite wasteful of fabric though, especially with a big print like this, because if you wanted to get this to match up with another mushroom, I think there's something like a 40cm repeat on this design on the edge of the fabric. I don't know, because this is all I've got left, literally, and I daren't throw it away because I just love it. But yeah, it's not difficult to do, but that is basic fussy cutting.